I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. This week on the show, well, look, I think that all of us, we've had our fair share of bad news in the world of international relations and politics. And in recent conversations with some folks I know around town, with some friends of mine, I am happy to say that I've come across a story where we might be able to find some hope. I think history is, as we've talked about on the show, it's full of so many moments where you feel let down. But as I've said many times, the thing that you got to look at is that at every moment people can make the wrong decision, and we live in a world that is shaped by both those bad ones, but also the good ones. Because anytime somebody could have made a bad decision and made a good one, it's worth looking back to and being grateful for. So today we're going to talk about the Good Friday Agreement and the conflict in Ireland, the long conflict in Ireland, this period of decades called the Troubles, and how, in spite of all that, we found something to be hopeful for. And we see improvement in a place where, a generation ago, 2 generations ago, people could not have imagined. So I want to use history to expand our imaginations as we spoke about in recent episodes. Before we get to it, just a reminder, we got our live show coming up May 29th at the Hamilton Live in Washington, D.C. We've got great lineup, Margaret Talev, we've got Major Garrett and Doug High. We're going to be talking about stories of murder and mayhem in the capital city in Washington, D.C. As always, you can get tickets to that and links to the podcast on all your podcast players at rtnpod.me/live. And before we go, as always, thank you to the patrons. You guys keep the show going, and I mean that, and I'm sincerely grateful to all of you guys. If you want to join us over there, it's patreon.com/theroadtonow. And if you can't, money's tight, I get it. Most of my life was like that, and still is sometimes. So if you guys just want to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and a nice review, or a 5 stars on Spotify, comment there. We've got comments now where you can comment on the episodes, and that engagement's always great. And, share it with a friend. If you know somebody who'd like this episode, and I think there will be a lot of people who like this one, because we're going to break down the history of Ireland, which I think is sometimes hard for us to wrap our heads around with all the conflict there. Share this with someone, and hopefully it'll brighten their day. So now let's bring in our guests for the show, and I'm really excited about this. I got to say, Ireland is one of these places that I'm constantly frustrated about, because I feel like I should know it because I know European history, but it's such a different place, and it has so many different stories that they don't fit the pattern, I think, when we think about Western Europe. So today, to talk about the Good Friday Agreement, the incredible turnaround there, what's happened since, and the current state of events in Ireland, we have 2 guests. The first one probably needs no introduction. I mean, I think this is the quickest turnaround we've ever had of having a guest on in two episodes so quickly together. Irish expert, you might not know this because he's mostly come on the show to talk about his fantastic music books, but a professor of history at MTSU, my colleague, and an award-winning scholar of the history of Ireland, Mark Doyle. Welcome back to The Road to Now.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's always good to have you, Mark. And joining us really for the first time is Greg O'Loughlin. And Greg knows this story from a different angle. He is the executive director of the Friends of Sinn Féin. He has worked in Irish politics throughout his life, and he knows the story well. Greg, welcome to The Road to Now.
It's great to be here, Ben. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is funny because we're actually recording this in separate rooms, but we've been together hanging out. Like these are 2 of my friends in Nashville, and this conversation actually that we're having right now came out of conversations we've had like at Mark's house, and we actually met up to plan this one. So this is great. So this is going to answer a lot of my questions, and I'm kind of playing along with the listeners right now because I'm excited to learn more about something that I really am interested in. So let's kick this off. All right. The Good Friday Agreement, 1998. I mean, really, if we think about it, it's an insane moment because nobody really saw this coming, and it's such a ray of sunshine in an otherwise dark sky. Greg, could you explain the Good Friday Agreement and what this does and kind of the moment in which it was signed?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's a pretty complex story and is kind of a bookend on a lot of history I'm hoping to listen to Mark describe and discuss. So the Good Friday Agreement is the peace accord that determines how this period of conflict would come to an end. But it's a pretty special in that it's not traditional settlement, which looks backwards and says, this is how we'll make sense of either land or property or rights, looking back to take care of the past. It looks forward. It's a framework for resolving difficult questions, essentially, which is no small feat. It's a legal document endorsed by the British and the Irish government that says moving forward, all parties are going to negotiate conflict using these terms and these mechanisms, these bodies, so that we can keep peace on the island and not return to a violent period. So you said 1998 is when it's signed, and it put into place a series of assurances, rights, guarantees, and new governmental bodies that have been used in the time since to politically and peacefully figure out the answers to difficult questions.
And the difficult questions were big because these are generational things. I mean, this is not a conflict that just came out of nowhere. It's remarkable because of this generational thing. So, Mark, let's turn to you, and we're going to turn Mark into lecture mode here because I've asked Mark to give us the big picture, what the conflicts were, and the story behind this agreement so that we can really appreciate how remarkable it was.
As Greg was saying, it's a very complicated story. I could go back to the 12th century. I could go back maybe even further. We don't have all day. So possibly the place to start is the early 1600s when Britain, which was in a dominating power relationship with regard to Ireland and had been for several centuries, actually at this point it's England and Scotland, introduced some colonization schemes. Colonizers from England, colonizers from Scotland, coming over into the recently defeated northern portion of Ireland known as Ulster. And the colonization was partly for economic purposes, partly with the idea of civilizing the Irish. But what it did was bring over thousands of Protestants into what was a predominantly Catholic island and had been fiercely independently Catholic for a long time, despite earlier efforts to convert. So the northern quarter of Ireland, Ulster, becomes sort of the Protestant heartland of Ireland, acquires a Protestant majority, at least in certain counties. And those folks tended to identify with and feel loyalty to the British crown, the English crown, Scottish crown, then the British crown after the merger of England and Scotland in 1707. From that point on, you can kind of see I should go back. In this colonization process, the incoming English and Scottish colonizers, they confiscate lands from native Catholics. There's unrest and rebellion. There's huge unrest and huge suppression of that unrest in the middle of the 1600s, and it sort of goes on and on from there. Protestants become the dominant force throughout the island. Protestants own most of the land. Protestants control the political levers of power, monopolize all sorts of economic activities and so on, and professions. And that goes on really up until it starts to erode in the 1800s. And then in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, there's a push for Irish independence by moderate nationalists trying to work through constitutional channels. There's a more militant, more violently oriented nationalist strand. Long story short, Ireland gains its independence in 1921-22, but it's over the objections of the Protestant, it's about a quarter of the population by this point, the Protestant quarter of the population, which has organized itself and armed itself in the years up to 1921 to try to resist any effort to sever their tie with Britain. And so when Ireland, the southern 26 counties of Ireland gained their independence in the 1920s, the northern 6 counties of Ireland remain tied to the United Kingdom. They become known as Northern Ireland, and they get their own little mini parliament in Belfast, which is now the capital of this province of the United Kingdom, which is still technically ruled by the British state headquartered in London, but is really kind of, it's not benign neglect, it's more malign neglect by the British, sort of left to do their own thing.
Could I just interject here, Mark? Because one of the things that's always fascinating to me is because of just the way that our world has been shaped, we imagine colonial relationships usually as like white Europeans colonizing people in other places and parts of the world. But there was very much like this ethnic colonization, this idea. Colonization in Ireland looks very similar to the colonization that the English are pulling off around the world, correct?
Yes, and especially in North America. A lot of the Ulster Scots, as they're known there, Scottish Presbyterians who settled in Northern Ireland or in Ulster, who actually had certain legal disabilities as well. They weren't first-class citizens in Ulster. A lot of them came over to this continent, to North America, and were kind of the vanguard of colonization in North America too. But it's true that what historians of Ireland often say is that Ireland is sort of a laboratory for what happens in the rest of the British Empire. Brits try different techniques of rule, different techniques of legislation, policing, and so on. They kind of try that out first in Ireland, and then it gets implemented or adapted to other parts of the empire.
Wow.
But I think it's important to name that this is an imperialist project. This colonization of a people outlaws the use of a language, outlaws the use of Irish names, outlaws culture, creates a colonial outpost. And then in the retelling, there's the Great Hunger on Gortmore. There's 1 million Irish killed and 1 million Irish leave the island due to this colonial act, this forced famine and starvation of a people. And we see this later on. So I think it's really important to name that it sounds like history book work and sounds like imperialism and sounds like colonialism, but it's really important to name these are small little islands very close to each other. And it's a laboratory for the British imperial estate to practice, well, how do we deal with language? How do we deal with culture? How do we deal with food? And to really sharpen and hone their imperialist skills.
Well, yeah, they got good at it.
It is important to say that there are sort of extremists in the British administration who would like to see, the total eradication of Irish culture and so on. They're not always able to get their way. The Irish language, the main reason that declines is because the people who mostly speak it by the 1840s are the people in the West, and they're the ones who are most affected by the famine. And there's debate about how much the famine was engineered by the British. I don't think there's really any debate about that. The famine was a natural thing. The debate centers on whether the British kind of saw this as an opportunity to clear out Ireland and open it up to more British styles of agriculture, clear all these people who were clogging up the land so that they can farm more and put money into British pockets, or if there were competing forces even within the British administration that were some people were trying to do the right thing, some people weren't. So, I mean, it's a complicated story, as we've said. But you're right. It's Ireland is in a subject relationship to the British Empire, although Irish people also benefit from the British Empire in various ways. There are Irish slave holders in the Caribbean. There are Irish imperial administrators and governors in India. So, and many, many Irish soldiers who fight on behalf of the British Empire, not necessarily out of ideological belief, but because that was where you could get a paycheck in a place where there weren't a whole lot of money available. So it's a complicated story, but yes, it's true that that's certainly how probably the majority of Irish people would see the situation in the early 20th century, is that, that we finally kind of shaken off this 800 years of oppression, except for that northern quarter of the population, which is Protestant, which sees itself as British, does not necessarily identify as Irish, which has long historical memories of their own stories to tell each other about the times when they were attacked and burned out and massacred by Catholics. And so there are these kind of competing historical memories, which make it really difficult to reconcile, even in the 1990s or early 21st century.
Yeah, and this is something that history and how its power. When people think about history as just a series of facts and dates, they miss the point. They miss the point that when two separate groups of people understand history in different ways, it completely scripts the way they have relationships with one another. And that story itself that we tell ourselves, if it becomes too different, then we can do horrible things to each other based on the idea that we've got some kind of trauma and we're justified in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you see this in many conflicts around the world, this kind of competing victimhoods, who is more oppressed than the other and who is therefore justified in taking extreme measures against the other. The tricky thing in the North is that by the early 20th century, the Protestant majority in the northern 6 counties, they don't see themselves as colonizers. They've been there for hundreds of years. They can trace their ancestry back hundreds of years. No more than most Americans today would see themselves as colonizers, even though they're on land that was, of course, taken from indigenous peoples. So saying, well, why don't you all just pack up and go back to Britain? That doesn't make sense in that context. And so this sort of hardcore of Protestants in the North, I don't mean to trivialize it. Those sort of the nut that's toughest to crack. Like they're the ones who kept the island from being fully unified at the moment of independence. They're the ones who insisted on partitioning the country in 1921. They are the ones who subsequently, and I don't think I got to this part yet, ruled Northern Ireland like their own little fiefdom, systematically discriminating against Catholics in all sorts of ways, in employment, in housing allocation, which becomes really important in Britain, in the British Isles after World War II, gerrymandering electoral districts so that Catholics are in permanent minorities, even in places where they are the majority in terms of population. And that's what sort of kicks off the troubles in the late 1960s, is this Catholic and sort of an alliance between Catholics and liberal Protestant protest against this systematic discrimination by the Protestant.
So is this classical imperial thing where you do the dance of like we have representative democracy or some form of representation, but you stack the deck to where the minority that had power before can stay in power?
Exactly. Yeah.
Bingo.
Okay.
Yep, that's the one.
That's something we're very familiar with.
I was going to say all of us.
Yeah.
All three of us live. I think Mark, who's your representative right now in Congress?
Oh, is it Rose?
Okay, I just wondered because we all live in Nashville, and there's a good chance that we have different representatives because they gerrymandered us into. I mean, me and Mark apparently are in the district with like the foothills of Appalachia, because we have the similar interests. Anyway, back to Ireland. So you have this period afterwards where you see that these 6 counties in the north are cut away from the Republic of Ireland, which wins independence. But then you have this, it's really the late 60s when you get the opening of the Troubles, where you see the violence breaking out on the streets, the things that people might be familiar with the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. What kicks this off in the 1960s?
Yeah, it's a peaceful protest movement at first. It's inspired in part by the American Civil Rights Movement. They have, marches that are inspired by the Selma to Montgomery March, and they sing "We Shall Overcome." And some of the civil rights leaders come over to the United States and associate with civil rights leaders and movements here. So it's partly just this sort of 1960s youth-led, often upheaval, not only here in the United States and in Ireland, but around Europe, Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe. It's kind of part of this whole global upheaval. It starts off that way. There's a new liberal-ish prime minister in Northern Ireland, still a member of the Protestant Unionist majority, but he is making a few overtures toward rectifying the situation with regard to discrimination. It's one of these classic cases. He doesn't go far enough for the people that he's ostensibly trying to appease, the Catholics. He goes too far for the people whose vested interests are in keeping things the way they are. That's the Protestant Unionists who have been ensconced in power since the 20s. And his name's Terence O'Neill, and he eventually gets kind of ignominiously, he's sort of shoved aside. But in that process, as happens, of course, in the United States, this peaceful protest is met with violence from the police, the Protestant-dominated Royal Ulster Constabulary, as well as other Protestant groups, both official and unofficial. And then, of course, this provokes violence in turn by Catholics, often young Catholics, who were sort of throwing stones at heavily armored members of the state, representatives of the state. And that, in turn, kind of, I don't want to say awakens dormant historical memories, because there had been significant riots in the North in the 1930s, but really you have to go back to the late 19th century to see really significant riots. But there had been this tradition of violence in the North, especially in the city of Belfast, beginning in about the 1850s and going into the early 20th century. Actually, I should go back and say that there's an extreme outburst of violence in Belfast during the Irish War of Independence in 1919 to 21. In any case, there are these sort of latent patterns of violence. The neighborhoods in a place like Belfast or a city like Derry are segregated. Protestants live here, Catholics live here, but they're also really close-knit and closely cheek by jowl. They live very close to each other in these kind of crowded urban slums. And so it's very easy for these competing ethnic identities or competing neighborhood identities to erupt into violence. And so you have homes attacked, Protestant mobs attacking Catholic homes in Belfast, some Catholics actually attacking Protestant homes as well. People are forced out. There's movement, forcible transfer of people, what we might call today a sort of low-level form of ethnic cleansing in certain parts of Belfast and elsewhere. And then the British government sends in the British Army to try to quell the violence. And when that happens, Irish Republicans, that is, people who want an Irish Republic, very different from an American Republicans in all sorts of ways. Irish Republicans who have this long tradition of resisting the British through arms, successfully in the southern 26 counties, unsuccessfully so far in the northern 6 counties. They kind of reactivate get a boost to their movement. And then it descends into a shooting war a 3-way shooting war between Catholic paramilitaries, primarily the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, various Protestant paramilitaries, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Defence Association, and others, and the British state and their kind of clients in the Northern Irish government.
And now what you have is you have that historical memory, these two different historical narratives. And now the sense of injustice that both of them have is met with recent events that simply stoke that even further. So no longer are these traumas things that go back generations. They're now, you killed my neighbor, you attacked somebody that I love, and that just makes it worse.
Yeah, I just was only going to add that in Ballymurphy and in Derry, for these civil rights marches modeled after Selma, it was not only the RUC or the police force there that were stoking violence, but it was the British Army that murdered civilians who were children, kids, families, priests who were marching. So it was an occupying army on Irish land. So it wasn't just the police force there or neighbors or Protestants. It was parachute regiment.
You're talking about, I guess, Bloody Sunday, Derry 72, where the British Army does kill 14 unarmed Catholic marchers.
Before that, in Ballymurphy in 1971, same thing.
Yeah. It's worth saying, though, that at first, and when the British Army first arrives in 1969, the Catholics welcome them. With tea and biscuits, and finally a neutral party has arrived to protect us from the sectarian Protestant police force and this sectarian Protestant state that's been discriminating against us for a long time. But the British Army is, of course, inherently devoted to preserving the status quo, preserving the power of the state, and so they kind of can't help but end up aligning themselves with the Protestant power structure. And so that initial welcome descends pretty quickly. And it is, of course, as a result of violence against Catholics.
Most welcomes will dissolve quickly after a couple dozen murders of civilians.
And I've seen photographs of Belfast, and they literally build walls across the city, right? Separating neighborhoods that are Catholic from Protestant. When does that all happen?
The segregation goes back to the 19th century. The walls, I don't know when I don't have it off the top of my head when the first big wall goes up, but it's, I think it is actually after the burning of Bombay Street in 1969. That's right. So the two key working class neighborhoods in Belfast are the Falls Road, which is predominantly Catholic, and the Shankill Road, which is predominantly Protestant. There'd been some mixing of the neighborhoods prior to 1969, but then once violence breaks out at a civil rights march in Derry in 1969, across on the other side of the province, there's communal rioting within Belfast, and Protestants burn out Catholics resident in Bombay Street, and there are some Catholics who attack Protestant homes as well in that process. And in the aftermath of that, they built these huge walls that just grow over time. I think even today there's something like 60 that are still in place. They're called peace lines. The idea is that
that's the peace walls they call.
Keep the people separate.
Good fences make good neighbors. Like that's
kind of.
What's interesting though is that these days it's actually local residents who are kind of reluctant to let those walls come down in a lot of cases because of the fear of violence from the other side. Because often it's like kids, youth gangs who will attack one another. So the walls are sort of seem like a form of safety, especially in Protestant neighborhoods. The Protestant population of Northern Ireland is declining. There's a concern in these old Protestant neighborhoods the Catholics will move in to their neighborhoods if these walls aren't kind of kept in place. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and doesn't, I don't know how you could show or how you would measure how effective they've been at preventing violence, but it certainly becomes a kind of a security fence for the people living on either side of them in a weird way.
So, Greg, you work in politics, and we've got this long story, and certainly I think there's so much more we could go into, but I feel like for the purposes of what we're doing here, we now understand what's at stake and why it's going to be so hard to fix it. So, Greg, could you just start telling us about the Good Friday Agreement? Like, how did these sides come together? Because our own president, Bill Clinton, was involved in this. Could you talk about that story and what it set in place to try to resolve these problems?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate Mark's retelling in many ways, kind of highlighting how it was a long simmering thing. It wasn't just a flash. These are family stories, generational experiences, and a trauma that goes back centuries. And I'm not sure the average age of your listener, or I'm not going to tell you my age, but for a long time growing up, this was headlines. We can watch violence on TV being reported from Belfast, being reported from Ireland. It was, I hate to think about it this way, but just like, that's just Irish people fighting Irish people. That's some ethno conflict that there'll just never be a solution for, because you can't negotiate through hate or ethno nationalism or whatever this is. It becomes a given. This is an intransigent problem, and we're gonna, it's a real shame it keeps happening. That's where and why this conversation about the Good Friday Agreement, I think you're right to name, is such a source of potential hope to see what's possible. So we can fast forward. I hope so. No one has hit fast forward 30 seconds too many times, because we've gone from 1600 to 1994.
I don't think we're fast forwarding now in relationship to the other ones in this one, Greg.
Yeah, exactly. So we got 1994 is when there is it looks like there's going to be the potential for a peace process, right? In order to begin to negotiate the terms of how we can stop violence on all sides. There is and this is really where you mentioned President Bill Clinton steps up, and for reasons I think maybe will be a great book Mark can write someday, or someone can write someday, determines that he wants to kind of take his own path on what has been told to America by British leaders for centuries. Right? They've been telling Americans, hey, listen, we don't tell you how to run your police force in Chicago. So what do you say you don't tell us about how to handle our problems in Ireland? We got it under control. It's a domestic issue, not an issue for State Department for you guys for dealing with. Clinton says, well, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that before I kind of go along with this. Just the line. We're just going to let you get away with doing what you're doing. Sees the potential for, if we can secure some ceasefires, if we can get all sides to stand down and create the space for peace, we might be able to make some progress there. And it's an interesting story, because that is a decision he makes on the campaign trail the first time around, really as the result of strong pressure from Irish America, organized political pressure from Irish America, saying, if you give a chance for peace to grow in this space, if you can separate your foreign policy agenda from what the Brits are telling you is what is the way to be, there's a chance here. It's going to take a great deal of risk. It's going to take a great deal of courage to separate yourself from what has been decades of foreign policy. But a chance like this has not been here for us for a very long time.
Well, how much of that had to do with his relationship with Tony Blair? Because it's like famously that Bill Clinton had this great relationship with British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Is that part of the story? Do you see him doing it?
Absolutely.
If, I don't know, Margaret Thatcher still around or something?
No, I think that it's part of the weather that people are using to determine this is a really good shot. I think they are very close. I think they do see a neoliberal vision for what's possible. We can bring change through market access. We can bring change through creating a whole bunch of economic engine. They both share this view. They both are very close and in on this wave of this kind of this worldview, and it's part of the ecosystem that is giving Irish America a great deal of enthusiasm to say, look, we're not going to get another shot like this for a very long time. What we think you should do would be to, and at the time, the request was to offer Gerry Adams a visa to visit the United States to begin talking about multi-party talks. This was the big ask.
Right. And Gerry Adams, who by actually Greg's intervention has been a guest on this show before, he was a leader for Sinn Féin. He was a leader who was trying to change the story of that party and of the relationship between Catholics and Protestants.
That's exactly right. And President Clinton, much to his favor there, was, I would argue, brave enough to say, well, in pursuit of peace, let's see what's possible. Let's see if we begin exploring, do we think a ceasefire is within reach? Do we think we could get all the parties together to talk to hammer this out? Do we think it's possible to move forward? So it's that change in the air with Blair, as you noted, and Clinton and Irish America, putting a great deal of pressure on, saying that this might not be something that we have to live with for another 30, 60, 90 years. There could be a shot here, and that shot could really start with granting Adams a visa to come to the States in 94.
Most of our audience is in the United States, and I'm sure we're all very proud of ourselves now for being such an important part of this. And I think there's reason to be proud of our intervention. But this didn't come out of nowhere. You said that in 94, there was this, the beginnings of some type of a movement in this, and then the Clinton picks it up in his second, when he's campaigning, that's 96. So he had something to work with. There was a reason for him to believe, that intervention would yield something positive. What happened that brought people to the table in 94 and ultimately started charting the path to 98?
The ceasefires, the Irish Republican Army and loyalist paramilitary groups declaring a ceasefire, saying that we want to negotiate to move forward. And Mark, do you have a different take here?
Well, I mean, as a historian, how far back should we go? I mean, go back to the
Mark goes, well, the Big Bang happened.
Exactly. There had been various points in the 1970s, 1980s when the governments of Ireland, Britain, not so much America, had tried to come to some sort of agreement. The most significant was in 73, 74, something called the Sunningdale Agreement, which was brought down by Protestant loyalist paramilitaries. There were some faltering efforts during the Thatcher years, that's 1979 to 90, but Thatcher was incredibly intransigent with dealing, she wouldn't talk to terrorists, right? And she defined the IRA as terrorists, and therefore she would not talk to them. And so not much was done. One of the things that happens at the end of the 1980s is, I guess it's worth saying that this is part of the complexity of the situation. You've got the Protestant/Unionist side, right? These are the people who want to stay connected to Britain. You've got the Catholic/nationalist/Republican side, and they're not all; those aren't equivalent terms, but they're all sort of on the same side of the fence. There are moderates and there are more extreme-minded people on both sides. There are people who try to pursue change through constitutional means. There are people who try or resist change through constitutional means. And there are people who try to pursue change through more violent or resist change through more violent means. One of the most important moderate Catholic leader was this guy named John Hume, who was the leader of a party, the Social Democratic Labour Party, the SDLP, who at considerable political risk to himself within his own party, reaches out to Gerry Adams, who's the head of, I don't know who reaches out to whom, but anyway, they start meeting in the late 80s, and then the talks pick up in the early 90s. Gerry Adams, who's the head of Sinn Féin, which is associated with the IRA, which is the extreme Republican faction. The Adams talking to Hume, that was politically very risky for Adams within the IRA. He had to bring the IRA and Sinn Féin along with him to do that. Hume reaching out to the IRA, whom moderate Catholics as well as everybody else tends to see as terrorists, that was politically risky for him. But they do secretly meet. Meanwhile, there's other sort of secret talks going on with the British government, with the Irish government, with the IRA. And so the ceasefire that comes out in 94 is partly a culmination of the Humes-Adams Declaration of 93, in which the moderate Catholics and the more extreme, or extremes may be a harsh word, but what should I call them, Greg? The more
zealous, the more excited,
more zealous Catholic/Republican side, they sort of come together and they say that, we recognize that Ireland will only be united as a result of the expressed will of the Irish people, right? That it won't be through violence that this is going to happen. We recognize that there is this Protestant group that is going to oppose this, and we will pursue peaceful means to promote and secure diversity within a united Ireland, all that sort of thing. So the IRA, they call it ceasefire 94. It doesn't hold and terribly well, but they break it at various points over the next few years, as do the loyalists. The Protestant loyalists also declare ceasefire 94, which doesn't hold in their various crisis points over the course of the mid-90s as they return to violence. One of the big things that changes, though, is this sort of you've got Clinton in the United States who makes Northern Ireland a priority. You've got John Major, who was not Margaret Thatcher, is still a member of her party, the Conservative Party, comes into power in 1990, stays until 97. He wants to make progress, but his parliamentary majority is so thin that he can't, and he actually relies on Ulster Unionist Protestant Party for his own majority in the British Parliament, so he can't really do much. But Tony Blair comes in with a really huge majority. I think he wins like 65% of the seats, so he doesn't have to worry about that. He's got a lot of political capital to burn. The Labour Party, Tony Blair's part of the Labour Party. The Labour Party's been traditionally a little bit more conciliatory than the Conservatives with regard to Northern Ireland. You've got a new prime minister in Ireland, in the south of Ireland, Bertie Ahern, and you've got these sort of extraordinary leaders kind of all over the place. It's, I know people talk about the founding fathers in the United States as being this kind of unusual convergence of people who have vision, who are courageous, who are intelligent, and all these things. I don't know how true that is in the United States, but there's a little bit of that with Ireland. That's just the leaders of the loyalists, the Protestant loyalists. Some of them were quite visionary and courageous in reaching out to their own members to bring them in out of the cold. The difference with the Good Friday Agreement is that whereas earlier peace initiatives had left the extremists or the zealots out in the cold and hadn't brought them into the talks, now in 97, 98, when we're having the talks to finally bring about the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin is sitting there at the table, and they can then go to the IRA and say, this is what's going on. The various leaders of the loyalist paramilitary factions are at the table. Not all of them, some of them walk out, but some of them stay, and they are able to go to their militants and say, this is where we are, this is why we think this might work and might be good for us. There's just this real effort that as Greg was saying, like a lot of people in America and elsewhere feel like now's the chance to seize it. Like this, we're not going to get this, the stars aligning in this way again.
Yeah. And Greg, you said this earlier, and what I really liked was you kind of referenced the idea that we're not going to let the past determine our future. Right? Like we're going to be able to see a better future than this storyline might suggest. And I know this is weird because it's like me and Mark are like, hey, you should know the history. Also, you should probably ignore it sometimes so that you can see through everything. But, again, I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this story is because you can look in the past and you can find the worst, but you can also find the moments of hope and the people who can see past, like, well, this is the way it always is. That's just the way it is kind of stuff. So Greg, could you talk more about that? Like, how do they then seek to put into effect an agreement that allows for the potential of a better future?
I think, and we have both mentioned, it's that knowledge of history that allows for the courageous action. You can say, okay, listen, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to get these same outcomes. And it takes courage to say, I think there's something better here. I think there's something better, the greater potential. So we have a negotiation process whereby leaders of every party are at the table. And at that stage, Clinton had sent over Senator George Mitchell to act in his stead to work and help his negotiation processes. And he worked with every party, listened to every party, and they hammered out a framework for the future. It was not a let's settle, we're going to go ahead and settle the score and write down, okay, who won this, who won that, well, how many points did you, it was not a settlement to determine what had just happened. It was if we're going to move together with a complete dedication to a peaceful democratic process, this is how we are going to discuss, negotiate, and come to a solution for very challenging questions. So a couple of times, Mark has referred to the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, their police force there. It's a contentious issue, right? If we're going to move forward with a new start and a new place where everybody feels welcome, we're going to have to create a new police force. What is that going to look like? That's hammered out in this agreement. We're not going to tell you what it has to look like, but we're going to say this is how we're going to make those negotiations work, and this is what that process is going to look like. And it's this sort of, let's name these key issues. Let's name all the relationships that need real clear borders, really clear goals, and the processes that we're going to do that. So that those are three strands. You have the strand of how are we all going to get along in the North? How are all these parties going to interact? How are they going to represent their constituents? How are they going to hold elections? How often all these are going to happen? And what are we going to do about the North and the South? How are they going to get along? What are those circumstances an institution could look like? And then there's the third strand, which is East-West. How will Ireland and Britain get along and work together?
You just brought up a great example, which is reforming, the police force, which had this, had this mark on it to a lot of people. Could you give us another example of, maybe the way that committees are formed? How does everyone get a seat at this table
to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement?
No, to be afterwards, like once they say, all right, we're going to reform the police force or anything like this.
This is probably the biggest piece of this, is that the terms devolve a great deal of direct democracy from decisions being made in Britain to just people in the North being able to vote for members of legislative assembly or MLAs for their own government held at Stormont. So this is a huge transfer of devolved powers that come from Britain, where people in Britain were making decisions about what was happening to people in Ireland. And as a result of this agreement, there's a new government formed that is going to be a key part of answering exactly those questions.
Well, it only took them a couple hundred years, but the British learned something from the American Revolution, sounds like.
You were talking about the importance of forgetting in some cases. There were a number of different issues that were very difficult to resolve with the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement, one of the things, the actual text, it sort of fudges these issues creatively in a way that all parties can kind of say, well, we can work with this because it's not defining exactly what we're going to do. One of them, the most contentious issue, has to do with arms. When are the IRA and the other paramilitary organizations going to get rid of their guns? It's called decommissioning. How is it going to be verified? How do we know that they've gotten rid of them all? How do we ensure that they can't get them back again? All that stuff. But one of the really interesting ones, and just as contentious in its way, was prisoner release. So the IRA, through Sinn Féin, the various loyalist paramilitaries, the UVF, the UDA, through their political representatives in the peace process, insist on the people that have been arrested, paramilitaries who often convicted of bombings, assassinations, killings, injuries, all sorts of things, that there be a sort of process for releasing these people. The essential thought there is that these are political prisoners. They were fighting in a political cause. Many people then and now see them as terrorists, see them as murderers. Many of the families of the killed are very vehemently opposed to these sorts of prisoner releases. This idea that somebody who bombed this pub and killed my brother is now walking it free because of some deal that this representative of some paramilitary cut with the British state. That has caused a lot of heartache, but there's been also a lot of people sort of saying, well, look, this is in a way the price you have to pay. You almost have to not forget that this happened, but have to accept that these sort of historical injustices are not actually going to be rectified, aren't actually going to be dealt with in a way that we would see as just on an individual level. But if you take the broader picture, you can see that this is necessary to bring about a wider peace. So that's a very touchy issue still for a lot of families. It's very tricky.
I kind of skipped over a big part here. The terms of this agreement were negotiated, but then were put to the people. Yeah. It was affirmed by two massive referendums. This was a big question of, this is the best we could do at the negotiating table. We have completely affirmed a commitment to exclusively democratic and peaceful means of resolving all conflict. This is how we're going to do that moving forward. What do you think? And this was an incredibly stressful time to see the campaign for, is this how we want our island to be governed moving forward? And it was two national popular referendums.
Yeah, one of which required, so the referendum in the South, in the southern 26 counties, the Republic of Ireland, required an amendment to their constitution. Two articles of the constitution essentially claimed Northern Ireland on behalf of the rest of Ireland, and look forward to the eventual unification, and by huge majority in the South, there was widespread agreement. Yes, we will change our constitution to help bring about peace, because the South was affected as well. There were killings, bombings in the South. There were, of course, people with close ties to people in the North and all that sort of thing. And then the North, the majority was thinner, was smaller, but it was still a significant and persuasive
71%,
in favor. Whereas, although I think it was a majority of Protestants voted against it, I think if I'm correct. Yeah. So, and that has kind of been the issue since Good Friday. So that's Good Friday, it's April 98. The Protestant, now it's a minority in Northern Ireland, has felt itself to kind of, well, gotten the raw end of the deal in various ways. And so one of the problems, one of the difficulties or the challenges for pushing for a united Ireland is to figure out how to accommodate and reassure the Northern Protestants that their viewpoints and their perspectives and their traditions will be valued in a unified Ireland.
According to Statistica, in 2023, they reported that 42.3% of Northern Ireland is now Catholic and 30.5% at that point. So it's a significant majority there. But you just brought up this point that that we wanted to tie everything together with, because there's so much more we could get into with this, and we'll post some links, some more information in the episode description. But now we're on this question of Irish unity.
Yeah.
And you now obviously have things flipped because you don't have a Protestant majority in the North. What's the status of that, Greg? Because this is something that you've been involved with, right? And something that
That's right.
that you're now actively being a part of this process. And so I don't want to leave without you telling the story of what you're doing. And you've got some events coming up.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's interesting to be able to discuss this in the context of hundreds of years of history as a live issue, but in many ways it is still a very live issue, specifically because, as Mark said, in some areas of the Good Friday Agreement, there was some language used to kind of let's not define it too perfectly so that we can move ahead and get everyone on board. You leave a little bit of vague language in there, and there's going to be some work that has to get done. And so that's where we are. So we talked about policing, we talked about devolved government, we talked about enshrining. We didn't necessarily discuss the enshrining of language equality, cultural equality, all of these things that the Good Friday Agreement brought to the fore. And a lingering question is, how will we resolve the issue of unity? How will we create a new and united Ireland?
Or does that need to happen, right? I mean, because there's still people who wonder if that's something that should be done. Right.
That's exactly right. So that process is being discussed now. It's becoming a more live discussion. There are papers, there are professors, there are research teams looking into the economic impact, the political impact, all of these questions. It's a question that the party that I work most closely with is really excited about and really wants to advance the cause of. Not everybody shares that same fervor, but it is undeniable that the questions that are being asked and the need to answer some of these questions are growing louder and louder every year. So that this is a key moment in the history of Ireland to be able to discuss what does that look like. Now, the Good Friday Agreement prescribes how we do unity using the same way we got the Good Friday Agreement, 2 referendums. We're going to hold a referendum in the North and we're going to hold a referendum in the South. And the document itself is unambiguous. And it doesn't say, well, and then we'll see what happens. It creates legal obligations and prescribes very specific thresholds for change if the votes are in favor of unity. This was part of the constitutional change, as well as the rights and changes to the UK system that allow this. So it doesn't create suggestions or we think this might be a good idea. It says at such time that the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland believes that the majority of the people of the North wish to be united with Ireland, they will call a referendum. This is where it gets a little vague. This is where it becomes a little bit of well, what are you going to use to determine that? Is it going to be a popular opinion poll? Is it going to be a show of hands? Is it going to be number of MLAs in Stormont? What's the number we're going to use?
It's like when this guy decides, when this guy's got the feeling.
That's exactly right. When he gets a little tickle, he's doing it, right? So that's that's going to be. So this is a question that needs a direct address. We need to discuss how we're going to move forward on that. Again, it's fair to make the case that that Ireland as is now is better. We don't need to unite. It's fair to make the case that I don't want to unite Ireland. That's okay. It's not fair and it's not compliant with law to say that we don't have to address the issue. That is a live issue and one that has to be asked and discussed and voted on. So in that kind of how do we figure this part out? Sinn Féin and others are Ireland's Future is another one. The Commission on the Future of Ireland, civic groups, political groups are hosting large people's assemblies and public events to say, listen, we all saw what happened with Brexit. This major
that was on the tip of my tongue. Like that's
Right.
suddenly there's a new incentive.
There's a new incentive. You see people who are asked to go vote in a massive referendum on changing the economic foundation of a nation and how it engages with the rest of the world.
The Republic of Ireland is still a part of the EU, whereas
Correct.
the UK left, which pulled those northern counties out. Within those 6 counties, what was the vote?
They voted to remain in the EU, but because on some piece of legal paper, part of the UK, they were withdrawn, which has really ignited a great conversation in the North about, well, but geez, unity could be advantageous to us to be able to remain in this. But I think the process of when people were asked to vote in the referendum for Brexit, it really wasn't dug into. Brexit's Brexit, vote or no. That this was the depth of dialogue around. Aren't there really important questions? It was a rough and rowdy campaign. Vote, leave, go, and it was really kind of tumultuous. The fallout was devastating to families, to businesses, to trade. It took many, many years to try to make sense of the broken pieces that a poorly run campaign and a poorly run referendum caused families, businesses all over. So looking at that outcome, looking at when we are way too fast, when we are hasty and don't ask questions and dig in, the outcomes are unpredictable and scary. And we want everybody who steps into the voting booth to determine, are we going to create a new and united Ireland or not, to feel very confident about what they're voting for when they vote for that. It's not one way or the other. It's we need to answer these questions. And so, as I said, the Commission on the Future of Ireland, Ireland's Future, Sinn Féin, many groups all over in Ireland and the north of Ireland and many in the United States are beginning to host events to say, hey, what questions do you need answered before you feel really good about however you're going to vote? What topics and priorities are key to your consideration that you want to learn more about before you go into that voting booth and vote? That process is live, as I say, happening all over Ireland, with these people's assemblies being hosted in Dublin and Belfast and Wexford, as well as being organized around concerns around farmers, rural life, lawyers, women, folks concerned about the climate. And what I'm most excited about, and that's why I'm thankful for your entry to discuss that, the role of Irish America and the Irish diaspora is as live and important now as it was, as we discussed there in 94, as it was back in 1916 at the GPO. The role Irish America plays all the way through the Irish history is vital and essential to the process. And so I'm hosting a series of events across the country that are free, that are open to the entire political spectrum. Everyone who wants to learn more about this and ask questions about these topics and ideas can come and discuss and learn. Oh, this is what we mean when we say a new and united Ireland. Does that mean we need to discuss pensions? Does that mean we need to discuss, does your driver's license work? And we have to all take new driver's tests if we vote for this? That's a weird one, but we can discuss it. We can talk about what has to happen.
We all get real IDs or whatever the thing is we got to get here.
Real IDs right away by May 7th.
They vote against it. Nah, we're good.
So these questions are vital, and an important way to answer them is by increasing the access that Irish America has to the process, as well as people all over Ireland. And so I'll be hosting an event here in Nashville, Tennessee on Wednesday, May 28th at the Scarrett Bennett Center, in Cincinnati, Ohio on Thursday the 29th at the Irish Heritage Center, and then in Chicago on Saturday, May 31st at the Irish American Heritage Center. And the purpose of these events is to bring everyone, if you are as brilliant as Mark and know everything from the Irish history from the 1600s to now, or if you don't think about Ireland maybe but once every March, but you kind of want to learn more across the political spectrum, to say, I do want to get involved. And this isn't a lecture where you're going to learn something and maybe take notes and go. It's a live ball right now. These questions are being asked in political quarters, and the answers we're providing in these spaces are informing the process and informing what steps need to happen next. And that's what feels so exciting about being able to double down on the courage it took our leaders to do this work, to say, hey, wait a second, this is awful, and we don't want this to continue. Where do we need to be brave? Where do we need to move forward and say we're going to make some change? We get to continue to double down on that courage and that bravery and say, yeah, I'm going to step up too. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to engage in a process that is going to ensure and underpin a peaceful solution that we can use not only to bring peace and maintain peace in Ireland, but also as an example that could be used around the world. This is a very rare window and invitation into international relations, into peacemaking, and into creating a really peaceful, more beautiful future.
It sounds like this is very much in line with the spirit of the Good Friday agreements, with the idea of participation, of input, of trying to make sure everyone's represented. And I just want to say, as we wrap up here, you look at this thing that is considered to be, unresolvable.
Yeah.
And you see that this type of an outcome, is possible. And if there's one thing that history teaches us, we look back at all the times there are these purges and this ethnic conflict and these attempts to eliminate people, even in the Soviet Union with the attempt to eliminate the enemies of the people. If there's one thing that history shows, well, you can't purge your way out of a conflict. You simply can't. All you do is create more trouble, more violence, more heartbreak for people. And I think that the sooner that people are willing to embrace what is, the past is very real and with us. And I understand there are harms that are hard to get over. But when we realize that we could, if we can find a way to love our brothers and our co-citizens and the people of the world, what we end up with is a chance to spare future people this type of heartbreak. And
in slightly more concrete terms, one of the things that the Good Friday Agreement, the process leading up to it and the outcome, which it wasn't all resolved in 98. Like, it took a long time for the Northern Irish Assembly to get up and running and all that sort of thing. One of the things that shows is that political leaders can not allow themselves to be led by their base, but to actually lead their base, to not be terrified of, angering their base and not giving, to say, okay, look, guys, I know this is what we've been committed to for these past few decades, but now it's got to change. If we're going to get what we want in the long run, we can't use the violent means that we've been using. Let's try more peaceful means. Or on the other side, and this goes for the Protestant side as well as the Catholic side as well as the British side. I know this is, the leaders talking to their base. I know we said we would never sit down and talk with men of violence, but if we're ever going to get anywhere, these are the people we got to bring in from the cold. Let's do it. And what you saw with the Good Friday Agreement on really all sides was this real attempt to not just, buckle under the pressure of individual parties' bases, but to really defy them in a lot of ways, or at least encourage them to think about something differently. And it hasn't always worked out well for those leaders that did that in the long run, but it worked out well for Northern Ireland. So just this idea of political courage, be a leader, not, if you're going to be a leader, lead, don't just follow.
No, that's we need more of that in the world, because it seems like it's too easy now to just say what people want to hear, and ride on that unfortunate energy sometimes. Mark Doyle and Greg O'Loughlin, this was fantastic. I've got to say, this is a story that I've had trouble wrapping my head around for a long time. And this is the best. I mean, we had a great conversation over at my house, earlier this week when we were talking about how to structure this conversation. I feel like this is when I'm proud to share this episode, because I feel like if there's got to be more people like me who are like, I want to wrap my head around this. So thank you. Mark Doyle, again, he's a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. Proud to say my colleague over there. And if you're wondering, you're like, isn't that the guy? Isn't that the same guy that had those great episodes on the Kinks and John Cale's Paris 1919? It is. He's multifaceted. That's
him.
And Greg O'Loughlin, just for those guys who were interested in your dates, you said you've got May 28th coming up in Nashville, the 29th in Cincinnati, the 31st in Chicago. Where can people find more? Because I know you're going to be doing more this year. Where can people find out more about you and when those dates are going to be?
Thank you for that. My website's friendsofsinnfein.com, and all of that is listed there. We also all of those are registered and free events, and you can find more on our Eventbrite page as well. But you can get all that on friendsofsinnfein.com, and I'll be sure to send out a link.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and putting the work to prep into this and everything. And I hope folks come out to your events, Greg. And Mark, as always, thanks for being a great guest.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.